Okay, practitioners, I have got a really awesome guest for us today. She is just going to blow y'all's minds about everything you need to build that dream practice. Well, welcome to the show, Jamie Van Cuyk.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here today.
Oh, we are just over the moon excited. Well, I would love for you to share your story of who you are and how you ended up here.
Yes. All right. I'll try to tell the short version of the story. So everyone assumes because I have a business dealing with hiring that I came from HR, but I didn't. I came from corporate leadership. I worked for an international marketing company and I was in operations and leadership. And in that, I got a lot of exposure to hiring because my team that I led was entry level for the organization. And typically they'd get poached by other departments in the organization. So we were always having positive turnover as people were getting promoted out, but that meant we were always hiring. And there was myself, there was 6 other peer managers that ran teams like I did. They didn't always have the time to hire. So I was always jumping in and saying, I'll help you hire. I'll run your interviews. I'll review the resumes. I have the time. I'll do it. So I got very used to hiring for other people because even though our team members really did all the same thing, they all worked on different accounts and there was different needs within those accounts. So I learned to figure out and ask the questions of, okay, what's different about this account? What's going to make the idea team member here? Because this idea team member for this account would be different than this one. But I left my corporate job back in 2016, not to start the business I have now, but to start a different business with my husband. He is a software developer by trade, and we had always talked about if we started a business together, it'd be something in software development. So he could lead the tech side and I could lead the business side. 6 months into doing that, I realized how much I hated being on that end of the tech world. Love technology, love being an early adapter to a lot of tech, but being on the back end, talking through the developments and figuring out all that stuff was not for me. So I sat there and said, what do I do? I'm not ready to go back to corporate, but I don't want to be in a business that I hate. So I started talking to business owners. I found out that through a lot of conversations that most business owners have never hired someone until doing it within their own business. And that surprised me because I had so much exposure when I was in corporate. And then I started talking to people who did hire a lot in corporate, but they said once they were doing it in their own business, they realized how much support they had when they were in corporate. They had HR teams, they had senior management, they had pre-written job descriptions. Sometimes they had the interview questions provided to them. And they're like, now I'm on my own and I have no idea what to do. And I didn't realize all the pieces of the puzzle that I wasn't involved in before. And they're like, I need help. And at first I was like, okay, I'm like, I don't know. I'm not coming from HR. Am I the right person to help? But then the more conversations I had, I realized that what they really needed help with was not the HR policies, processes, and procedures that you really need that HR background for. It was just, how do you identify who you need on your team? How do you identify, once you know who that idea candidate is, how to identify them in the pool of candidates that you get? And then how do you onboard them so they go from this person that you want to hire to this really effective team member? So over the last 4+ years, have developed growing your team. And now we help businesses in all industries across the country and beyond find their perfect fit team members.
Oh my gosh, I think I have 1,012 questions. As I'm sure all of our listeners do as well, because you're so true. And you were saying that most business owners have never hired anybody. And let's not even getting into letting go somebody. But I think that's a whole piece of the puzzle where you're like, well, I know how to run the business, but I don't know how I want to run the business. I don't know what somebody that isn't like me needs to be. So I guess, right, where do you even begin as far as like, when you are, let's say like, okay, we have the job description, all those great things. Like, how do you start to evaluate people? Like, I just love everybody. I'm like, well, I just want to keep all of the puppies. I don't know.
Right. The first thing to really focus on is knowing what you need. And so typically people focus on the skills. Okay, I need someone to do X, Y, Z in my company. So anyone who could do X, Y, Z is potentially a fit. And that's not necessarily true, especially if you're a smaller practice and a smaller business. you're building this culture, they need to also fit into your culture. And part of that culture is being able to meet your expectations. So it's not just, can they do this detailed oriented work? Do they have these skills? It's, do they have these skills and can they execute it in the way that's going to make me happy? And that's the part that most people forget. And then it's like, okay, once you know that, really developing a process that pulls out the right information. Because the other mistake a lot of people make is saying, I connect with this person, so I really want to hire this person. I could totally see myself in the office every day with this person. We're going to have great conversations. And then that person comes in and you're like, oh my goodness, they don't even know how to turn on a computer. Like, this is not the right fit at all. So it's, how do you identify that they are the right fit for the position that needs to be filled versus just a personality fit or someone that can check off the tasks?
Yes. I like, because we're going through an interview process right now. And I think that's one of the hardest things I'm realizing is it's great, especially in the line of work that we do. It's easy to connect with people. It's easy to pull stuff out and really have that like personal connection, but to evaluate their skill set and evaluate if they're a cultural fit through questions and that first meeting, how in the world do you do that? And like, where do you come up with those questions or anything?
Yes. Yeah. So when we're working with our clients, we actually spend the most time coming up with the questions, which I think it's probably surprises most people, because I know when I first started hiring in corporate, I would just go into an interview and wing it. I wouldn't have anything prepared. I'd be like, yeah, these are some of the areas that I need to know about. Let's just see where the conversation takes us. And I quickly learned that's not effective interviewing. You need to have good questions. So you need to prepare. And then it's figuring out, what do you need to know? So it's like when you've really thought about, who is this idea candidate that I need on my team? What's going to make me happy? You then should have a list of everything that you want to identify. Okay, well, what question is going to help you identify that? And then sometimes it's a matter of, you don't want to ask that directly. You want to ask something that's going to help you uncover that information, but in an indirect manner. So that way you can really see the candidate's thought process. Like sometimes we ask questions because we want to identify thought process. We don't actually care what the situation was. We want to see, how do they handle certain situations? And the other thing with questions is asking things what's called behavioral interview questions, where you want them to support their answer with real examples from the past of how did they handle this type of situation. Give me an example of type questions. Can you support your answer with an example? Because anybody can study and prepare for an interview. Anyone can tell you, well, I went out and studied for 3 hours, so I know what that term is. I know what I should be doing in these situations. But what would they actually do? And past behavior is the best indicator of future behavior. So you want to figure out, how did they handle similar things in the past to see, will they handle these situations in the future the way I want them handled in my business?
So it's so interesting you're saying that, because we have a couple of those questions in our interview process right now. And me as the interviewer feels absolutely awkward asking him, of like, tell me about a time when I don't know if that's just me and my own stuff, but I feel so awkward. I'm like, just seems silly. So how do you guys kind of help to make it more conversational, or not, or maybe it's just me and I just need to get out of my own head, but how do you kind of help the interviewer make these interviews not so like robotic of like, tell me about a time, or how would you handle this? Like, so it's not so weird. I don't know. Maybe that's just me.
So that is actually a good question. And some of the things that I will add to that is, maybe you need to try not to make it so conversational. And there's a few reasons why I say that. Is one of the mistakes I see people make when they go to interview is the interviewer asks the question and then keeps on talking because they want the candidate to feel more comfortable.
Oh, that's so
And
mean.
a lot of times when you keep on talking, you're starting to explain the question and you're starting to tell them what you want to hear and all this stuff. And it's, like I say, you don't want to lead the witness. You don't want to tell the candidate, here's how I want you to answer this question, because then what are they going to do? they're going to answer the question the way you just told them to answer the question. So I always say, ask the question and then stop talking. If the candidate needs more explanation and they ask for something and they ask for clarification, yeah, like give it to them. And that could always be a sign. Do they understand what you're looking for? There's some questions like if they don't understand XYZ and the question, then they probably don't have experience there. But sometimes you're asking, like I say, sometimes those indirect questions, and sometimes they might need it because people interpret things different than what you have in your mind. So they just might need a little bit of help to figure out what are you looking for? So if they ask a question, give them that clarification. But once you ask a question, stop talking. The way then to kind of bring it into a conversation is with follow-up questions. So when we develop the interview guides for our clients, there's a lot of our questions is like, here's the question you're going to ask the question, stop talking. Then when they give you their answer, here's maybe one, sometimes we have as many as 4 possible follow-up questions where you can ask to dig deeper. You can ask for clarification. Sometimes a candidate will give you all those. I turned that off. Sorry about that.
All good. All good.
Yeah. So sometimes candidates will give you all the information that you need in their initial answer. So no follow-up questions are really needed, but sometimes you want follow-up questions because you didn't get everything you need. And sometimes we love providing those follow-up questions because you might be really impressed by their answer, but did you actually get what you needed? So once it's all on paper to say, okay, maybe I need to ask this to get this level of information from them. The other reason why you sometimes want to make it so it's not so much of a conversation is the fact that you can start getting yourself into dangerous territory. So there's certain things that you don't want to ask about during an interview because it could lead into things where people could say, well, I was discriminated against during the interview process. So an example here is you can't control what a candidate's going to tell you about. So a candidate might tell you that they have 4 kids. Well, you don't want to start asking about their kids because then you, as the interviewer, continue the conversation about kids. And then they could say, well, they found out I had 4 kids and I didn't get the job. It must be because of that. And they discriminated against me because I'm a parent and they thought I wouldn't be dedicated to the role. So it's one of those things where sometimes it's really hard, like, and you want to be like, yeah, and you want to connect with them. Like me as a mother myself, if someone tells me like, yeah, like this is my kids and I have 2 girls, part of me wants to be like, I have 2 girls too. Like, that's amazing. But it's like, oh, wait, no, don't talk about that. Don't continue on that conversation. Cause like I said, you can't control what the candidate says, but as soon as you continue that conversation and ask follow-up questions about things like that, then you made it a part of the conversation.
Jamie, you're rocking my world. You have no idea. So one, thank you for everything, because I actually have 2 interviews for possible candidates right after this. So like, this is helping me. I'm like, oh yeah, I totally 100% have led the witness. And that's kind of been our inside joke of like, oh, Adrien leads the witness because she loves everybody. And so this is like helping me. So I'm like, oh, this is great. I'm taking all these notes. And you're so true about the conversation. People are like, oh yeah, I've got kids. I'm like, oh, tell me everything. Oh, that's so amazing. And so that I could definitely see, oh man, I have stuck my foot in my mouth a few times because I'm just curious. And so I guess when you are interviewing people or like coaching y'all's clients on it, how do you help them kind of to like turn off their human side and be more robotic, just like have them be quiet the whole time?
Yeah, and it's one of those things, like as a business owner, you want to put your personality in there too, because this person's going to be working for you. They're evaluating you just as much as you're evaluating them. So it's figuring out, how do you keep your personality in there without crossing the line of where of what you should be doing during the interview. So there's different ways you can bring your personality in. And so some of the ways we do it with our clients is you're going to introduce yourself at the beginning. I always tell people, and some of my clients are like, oh my God, I completely forgot to introduce myself because I just figured they know who I am because they're interviewing with me. And I'm like, you still want to have that introduction. You still want to make them feel comfortable. You want to remind them who they're speaking with and stuff like that. So you could always bring your personality in there at the beginning. You're going to introduce them with your name, with your title. You could tell them a little bit about the company. I always say at the very beginning of the interview, don't give away too many details about necessarily the company and what you're looking for there, because one, they should have read the job description. Two, they should have done some basic research and they should know the general information about what they're applying for and what they're interviewing for. And you don't want to give them a whole lot of information at first that then they're like, oh, well, you said you want someone like this, so now I'm going to tweak all my answers to support that. No, you've already told them some of that during the job posting, so don't put it back in there. But then sometimes at the end, I always say, tell them more about the company. And this is very important in a lot of cases. If your business has certain values or certain things that you follow that you can't ask about during an interview because it might bridge over into some of those discriminatory areas, but are very important to the way you run your business. So for example, if let's say you are highly religious and that is a very important part of your practice, but you can't ask people about their religious beliefs. You can't necessarily ask if they're comfortable with this. You can't ask someone, if we start every day with a team prayer, will you participate? Because no, that might make it so they are like, oh, wait, you found out I don't want to pray with you every day, so you didn't hire me. What you want to do there is say, we're going to provide information so people can deselect themselves from the process. And it's the same with your personality as well. If they're like, I don't want to work with you because this doesn't mesh, you're going to drive me crazy every day, let them deselect themselves from the process. So sometimes giving that little blurb at the end of the interview of, let me tell you more about the organization or more about me, can give them the insight of what they'd be coming into without having to say, would you be okay with this? Are you comfortable with this? Do you like a boss that's XYZ? Or would you be okay with coming into an organization where these are our core values? So it's just kind of giving that statement. And there you can let your personality go because you're sharing information with them. You're not asking anything from them.
I love that. That's amazing because you do want to have that personality and share some of that and kind of make sure it is a cultural fit. And sometimes those questions are hard to kind of weave in. So I love that. And I'm a huge fan of people deselecting themselves. That makes it a lot easier. So as you were talking, I've heard when you said the process of interviewing, I've heard oh, you need to have multiple levels of interviewing, like a phone screen and then this and that. What is y'all's recommendation when you're working with your clients about how many interviews should people go through?
Yes, great question. I say at least 2.
Okay.
And so the first one should be some quick, no more than 30 minutes. If you can get it less than that, do it phone screen or even a Zoom conversation. So something just virtual. So that way no one's having to take the time to commute to do it. The reason why you want to have that first short interaction is a resume only tells you so much. It's a piece of paper. And if you try reading between the lines and figure out the candidate's life story, you're always going to get it wrong. And people can put the same line on their resume, but what that line means to them is different. So when you review a resume, you're saying, okay, do they have the basic qualifications to get that first conversation where we're going to dig more to really learn? And that first interview, you're going to learn to say, okay, these basic things, the most basic things I need for this position, do they have the right experience and everything? If they do, then they move on to that next conversation, which is going to be a more in-depth interview, which can be in person if your job's in person or you have the ability to do in-person interviews, or if your job's fully remote or you don't have the ability to do in-person interviews, doing another remote Zoom interview or something like that is perfectly fine for that second interview round as well. The reason why I say at least 2 and not bringing all those questions into the first interview to say, well, let's just get it done with, is I think you need 2 interactions with someone before you hire them. When I've hired for my own business, I've hired 2 employees so far. And both times I've hired, my front runner from the first interview came into the second interview and was almost immediately a no. But I loved them after that first interview. And it just so happened that when we dug deeper, they weren't right when we dug deeper, but it also gave me time to think through it. So I went through that first interview round and it allowed me to really think about the candidates and what did I really want and kind of refine things a little bit more. And then went into that second interview and was able to really focus on, okay, now I'm clear of what I want. Let me make sure that everyone's meeting the mark and checking off the right boxes. And I'm not being swayed by, we really got along in this first interview and they met the mark there, I'm going to hire them. So I felt with both of my hiring instances for my own business, if I just had that first interview and hired my front runner off that first interview, they wouldn't have worked out. They wouldn't have been the right candidate. And so sometimes you need that second conversation. It also gives the candidate time after that first conversation to really think more about, okay, I've gotten this basic level of information about you and the organization. Now let me think about it. What else do I need to know to make sure this is the right fit for me? So it gives that candidate that time as well to ensure it's that good long-term fit.
Oh, I love that. I think that that's so helpful to know, like, okay, one just isn't enough because you might just love them. And then when you dig deeper, oh, that's such great advice, man.
Yes.
Oh,
yeah. And then I did say at least two. Sometimes there will be a third interview in there. And I would say if there is a third interview, there should be a purpose for that third interview. And typically my clients that pull in that third interview, it's because they want their team's opinion as well. So that third interview, it might be a more casual team style panel interview where they get some feedback from the team and bring their team into the hiring process as well.
Oh, that could be. So when you say panelists, is it like the person in like a panel of people to interview them?
Yes.
Oh, that could be kind of scary.
So it could be like 3 or 4 of your team members with speaking to the candidate at once. It can be a little scary for the candidate side, but if you think about it, it's a third round of interviews. So by that point in time, if they're going on there, they're interested in the position and they want to know more. So like I said, it's typically a little bit more casual. We focus a lot on those to say, all right, if it's a 45-minute interview, it might be 20 minutes of questions from the panel to the candidate, and then 20 minutes of questions from the candidate to the panel for them to really learn what it's like to work with your company. So once again, you want to prep your team of don't go down the rabbit hole of talking about anything that you shouldn't be talking about, but really keep it business focused, having them give insight to the candidate of what it's really like to work there. What is the flow of work like? What type of clients do you really handle? What challenges exist there? And let people really understand, do they want to be a part of that team?
Ah, that's great. I'm like rethinking our whole interview process. I love it. So when you're working with y'all's clients and like helping them through this interview process, like how long is like from job posting to hire, like what should I kind of like budget as far as time for that actually to happen?
Yes. Oh, you're asking so many great questions. I'm loving all these. All right. So time, it all depends. But what I will say is right now, as we're recording this in the spring of 2022, this hiring market looks completely different than normal. Some hiring processes are taking way longer than normal right now. So if you're hiring, around this time, you probably are going to have to add a little bit to anything that I'm going to share. Just because it's the way the candidates are flowing, it's just slower than it has ever been in my history of hiring for people. But with that being said, the length of the process normally is dependent on how much time you have to give to the process. So you can only hire candidates if you complete the interviews. You can only have the interviews if you make time to review resumes. So the more time you have to dedicate to that part of the process, the quicker you can get through things. But if you only say, well, I only have 2 hours a week where I can do interviews because the rest of the time I need to be seeing patients, it's going to take a lot longer to get through the process. So that's one thing to keep in mind is the length of the process is typically very dependent on you.
Nice.
When we do recruiting for our clients, it is typically an average of 6 to 8 weeks from when we start and kick off the process to when that new hire starts. And if you think about it, most candidates have to give 2 weeks notice before they start with you. So we're talking about 4 to 6 weeks from when we start to when that candidate is saying yes, and then 2 weeks until their start date. And that includes, for us, that also includes, we have to develop everything for the process. We have that kickoff call, we develop everything. Typically that job posting's going up to a week and a half later after we kick off, then goes through, we do our interviews, then the candidate or the client does their interviews, and then they make their decision. So typically you're looking at about, like I said, 4 weeks from kickoff to probably when that candidate is saying yes. And that sometimes is shorter, but when it's shorter, it's because we are working with clients that says we're 100% dedicated to this process. You send us a candidate, we're going to be ready to interview them within the next day or two. And if our team's going to be doing that last interview, we're going to be ready and have our team jump in and do that interview right away because we want this position filled right away.
Oh my gosh, where were you when I needed this? I love it. So if somebody wanted to work with you, what is it? So it kind of sounds like that's what it looks like, or am I missing other? So what if we were like, oh, we need to hire Jamie and her team because this is way outside our scope and we don't have time for it? What would that look like?
Yeah. So we work with clients 3 main ways. So the one way is the full service recruiting. And that is typically it. Like you mentioned, people are like, this is great, but I don't have time to do it. I don't have time to post a job and source candidates. I don't have time to review the resumes. I don't have time to do 2 rounds of interviews and figure things out. So we come in, we have a kickoff call where we learn about your business, about what your ideal candidate is. We create the job posting, all the interview guides, everything that's going to be needed for the process. And then myself and my team lead that beginning part of the process. So we do everything up until we say, here are candidates that are worth your time. You need to interview these top candidates. And then we help coordinate those interviews between you and the candidate. You do those final few interviews, you make your decision, and then you're hiring your new team member. So that's one way. So we do the full service recruiting. We take a lot of the work off your plates. We then have 2 other levels depending on what you need. If you're not ready for that full service recruiting, you're like, I have the time, I just need help figuring everything out. We have our basic package, which we call our hiring strategy creation package. And there we're creating your job posting and we're creating your interview guides that then you use 100% on your own to execute and market. So that's a lot of times we say it's for our clients that have hired before. They understand the process. They're like, I'm just not good at writing a job posting, or I have no idea what to ask. And I don't want to spend the time researching questions and developing questions. Like, just tell me what to do. So we have a lot of clients that they've come back to us time and time again. Every time they're hiring for a new position as their business is scaling, they're like, hey, Jamie, can you help us develop this position, write our job posting, do our interview guides, and then we got it from there. And then our third way that we work with clients is we really focus on education and training about the hiring process. So it's our one-on-one consulting. So we create everything that you need for the process. You execute it, but we're there with you the entire way. So we're teaching you how to go about posting the job. We're teaching you how to review resumes. We're really getting you ready and prepared for those interviews. We're helping you sort through the candidates. So we're doing that education every step of the way. And with that package, our goal is you go through this hiring process with us once, and then you feel confident every other time you go through it. So we've had clients who have gone through that and they were hiring was something they feared. They've had countless bad hires. They dreaded every time their business was scaling and allowed them to hire new team members because they're like, it's going to be a nightmare. And they go through that package once and they're like, oh my gosh, this was the easiest thing ever. Like, we found our new hire. And in the future, they sometimes come back and say, okay, well, now we want you to take over the process. Can you do the full service recruiting? Or they're like, just create us our hiring, our job posting and our interview guides, because we got it. We know what to do. So that's one thing we pride ourselves on is we really love to teach about the hiring process. So you become the expert.
Oh my gosh, that sounds absolutely perfect and needed for so many of our listeners, because we get questions all the time of like, where do I even begin? I don't have time. So where were you when I needed you? Oh my gosh, I'm so excited to meet you. This is wonderful. So how can we learn more about you and all of your wonderful services?
Yeah, so you can learn more about growing your team by going to growingyourteam.com. We're also on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, all under Growing Your Team. And we run the Growing Your Team podcast. So we put out new content every week, teaching you how to hire and lead team members for your business.
Oh my gosh. We will put all of those links in our show notes, Jamie. This is absolutely wonderful. But before we go, I always ask all of our guests, like if there is one thing that our listeners can do today to help move their practice forward, help to grow, what kind of advice would you give somebody that is listening today?
Yes. Oh, again, great question. I love this. All right. So one of the pieces of advice that I will give is in your practice, you're in your practice for a reason. And typically it's not to do the admin, clinical work and everything there, the clerical work. It is to do what you were trained to do. But typically what I've realized is a lot of people, you guys are smart, you are driven, you took a lot to get here. And that sometimes means you like being in control. So it's really hard for you to give up things and trust other people. And so one of the things I want you to ask yourself over and over again when you start to get overwhelmed is, does this have to be done by me or does it have to be done right? Because there's a lot of things in your business and your practice that does not have to be done by you, that you can delegate to an admin, you can delegate to an office manager, you can delegate to someone else who's going to help you in your practice, that you don't have to do it, that it just needs to be done right. And you need to help that person understand what it means to be done right by your expectations, but you don't have to do it all. So I know sometimes it's hard to give up that control because you are driven. You took a lot to get here and you deserve to be where you are, and your practice is growing because of the effort that you've put in. But just remember, you cannot do it all. So some things you should delegate and you don't have to do it. And just think of that. It's kind of like, it's a reward. You've been doing so well that you are overwhelmed and can't do it all. So see it as a sign of achievement that you get to delegate those items.
Oh my gosh. I think you are in our heads. Like, I think everybody that's listening is like, how does she know this about us? Oh my gosh. Like, you are 100% so true. I used to always tell people is that you got to delegate or you're going to die. So I love that. Oh, Jamie, this has been absolutely a treat to have you on our show. Oh, thank you so much for hanging out with us today.
Yes. Thank you so much for having me.